Hello and welcome to a new Oxygen XML live webinar. My name is Alim Belu and I will be your host for today's event. I want to bring to your attention that this represents the start of a mini-series of crash courses created for the people who want to be able to define the look and format of their documents, but struggling to grasp the basics of CSS or just want to get even better at customizing. This is why I invited my colleague, Julian Lecor, software developer at Synchrosoft, the company that develops the Oxygen suite of products, to tell us more about transforming XML and HTML documents to PDF. In this first part, he will be talking about the basic CSS layout. But before we start, allow me to give you some useful information about today's webinar. Know that all of our events are being recorded and this one makes no difference. The recording will be made available on the event page on our site oxygenxml.com, along with the slides and samples of Julian's presentation, and also the recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel called Oxygen XML. Another important aspect is that as we go along, we wholeheartedly invite you to ask us questions by using the questions panel from the GoToWebinar interface. Dan Capriuara, one of the founders of Synchrosoft, will stand by to answer your questions in real time. With all of this being said, now I'll give the floor to Julian Lecor. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Aline. Thank you for the presentation. Hello, everyone. So let's start this webinar. So as Aline says before, for this webinar, as it's the first of the series, no CSS background is needed at all. The aim of this webinar is to show how to start from scratch the CSS customization for PDF documents. For this webinar, I will use HTML documents and XML documents. And now let's start with the introduction. What is CSS? So CSS means Cascading Style Sheets. It has been created to enable a separation between the presentation and the content, so the text you are presenting. It makes easy to reuse the styling across multiple documents, as it can be used externally, so you can reuse these style sheets in all your documents. And it defines a specific cascading priority scheme. Before we start, we will submit 2 polls. So the first one will be what is your level of CSS? And now you can go to the side panel of the GoToWebinar and check your level for never use, basic, or if one of you is a CSS guru, maybe. We will let a few seconds now, then I will make a small analysis about the result. Okay, I think we can close the poll. So it seems that most of you have a basic knowledge of the CSS syntax. So this webinar will be more like a huge reminder for you. But a few people also never use CSS. So for you, it will be a good starting point. And for the people who already use this function or pseudo elements, you will maybe, as for the basic knowledge guys, you will have a small reminder, and maybe not this webinar, but the next ones will give you a more satisfying content. Let's go to the second poll. So what type of document are you currently using and you want to customize using CSS? You may choose XML, data, HTML5 maybe. And if you have other type of document, don't hesitate to indicate it. As for the first one, we will stay a few seconds to see the results. Okay, I think we can close this poll too. It seems that the majority of the users are XML and data users. So unfortunately for the data users, this will be more XML centered, but the CSS example I will give in this webinar can be used in data with small modifications. For the HTML5, it will be the same, and it seems that a few people maybe use other type of documents, maybe dogbook or even others. So for the majority of you, this webinar will be exactly in your needs, as it's XML and HTML documents. So let's continue to the introduction, and now we will go further to the CSS syntax. So here you can see CSS, what is called a CSS selector. So here, for example, it applies on the headers, the HTML headers, so H1, 2 to 4. It declares some properties, and for each of these properties, you will find one or more values. Let's continue now to something maybe not all of you knows. It's the CSS priority scheme. So I will present from highest to the lowest importance. So the first one be the CSS will be above all the others, and the last one will be the lowest priority. So if something is above it will not apply on your documents. So for example, the first one is quite obvious. It's the CSS important annotation. This makes the property the most important from all the properties. Then you will find all the media types. I will give you some other example of media a little further. The user define CSS style sheet. So your custom style sheet, you will mainly use this point in your customizations. The rule order, you have to know that the CSS style sheet is applied from top to above. So the last rule will be the higher priority. So if you declare something from the, I don't know, the paragraphs in multiple location inside your style sheet, the last one will be used and applied if the same property is copied in multiple places. Then the inheritance, if you have something applying on the paragraphs and you have some bold and italic content in it, it will apply also in this bold and italic content as they are inside, so their parent is the paragraph. Then we have the Oxygen default CSS rules for data or HTML, for example. And at the bottom level, the user, what is called the user agent. So, and we will see a little further what is called the user agent with some example in HTML. Another set of rule and priority is the specificity. So what we can resume as the longer the rule, the higher its priority. So if in your style sheet you are using only paragraphs, a rule containing the selector divider paragraph will be used with a higher priority. So it will be used after and it will be applied on your document. The same example for the list, for example, an order list containing a list item, the rules contained in this selector will be override if another property is contained in another selector, for example, body paragraph, an order list, and list item. Next, also the selector type is really important if you are using IDs in your XML elements, or if you are using classes selector. The classes selector also includes all the pseudo classes and the attribute selector. For example, if you use the first child CSS selector, Or for example, for the links, you have a selector containing the href attribute. And the last priority is the classic element selector. And you have the example below. So the main is the ID. So the main ID is the first used in this case. Then we will apply the example class, and at the end the paragraph classic element. And as a reminder, as I said above, if two selectors are identical, the last one will be used for the same properties. Now we will continue to the CSS media types, and especially the one we support inside Oxygen and Oxygen PDF chemistry. So we support the print media, which includes normally all the rules you will apply on your page materials and your documents, which scope is to be seen as a PDF, for example, or to be printed materially on paper. So for example, if I want normally my whole document to be black, so I will use the media print to define this, all the document to be black. And we have a specific media selector, which is the Oxygen chemistry selector. It's quite similar to print, so it applies only on printed media and on PDF media, but it applies only for documents that are generated using Oxygen PDF chemistry. So if you are using another processor, this will be not recognized by the processor and will be not in the final result. So before we start directly in the document, a little reminder for maybe some of you, for people which are not a knowledge of this in Oxygen, you can debug the CSS. So what we call debug the CSS is really useful for identifying why a rule is not applied in your document, to see why if there is another rule overriding it, or if the rule is not correctly written, etc. You can do it both in Oxygen's author mode and in your specific web browser. So for example, now I will go to my Oxygen. Here we have a small example of an HTML document talking about CSS, taken from Wikipedia. And as you can see, I already see this document is already contain some style already, the titles, the bold content, and using the CSS inspector or using the inspect styles option, I can check what CSS style sheet are applied on each content. So my paragraphs, my titles, extra. I can do the same on my web browser. So just I open the web browser console. As I done in Oxygen, I can inspect my elements and I will see what is applied on these documents. So the advantage of this method is I can see which rule is applied on which item, including on most of the case, the default user agent and the computed values and the fonts for the browsers. So for example, if I get back to my HTML example, here I can see that these rules are defined as user agents. So these, in fact, are the default rules applied by the browser on an HTML document. So you don't need to copy this rule on an HTML document. But if you take an XML document, you will not have this content, as the browser does not recognize XML as an HTML file. Here we have the same rule. So the default user agent is the CSS HTML.css. And as you can see, these are the rules applied on these documents. You can find directly, if you prefer this view, to see only the computed values. So exactly the values applied on the selected element. And for the the browser, you can also see the font used to display this content. Another thing interesting in this case is, for example, if you want to use, you can use the box model. So the box model is in your browser. So it's this little box here, and it's divided as the following. So we have at the middle the content defined as with a width and height here. So here will be your text display. We have the first area which came close to your text. It's the padding zone. So as you can see on this example, no padding is defined. That means no space will be integrated to your content. After, we will find the borders, left, top, right. And at the end, outside of the border, the margins. As most of the documents you will edit needs to have a margin to not be close or glued to your page size. So before we continue, I will explain a little more of this example. So for this webinar, I will use two examples, the HTML example and the XML example, sorry. So as you can see in the XML document, the content is quite similar to what is in the HTML document, but as I told you before, as no CSS is applied by default on this document, all the content is displayed as a single line. To help us customize this, we will use the following. For our XML documents, we will use a main CSS, which will be applied on this. And to make it easier to read, I will use two sub style sheets, which are here imported, which one for the titles, which for at the moment is empty, and another one for the content, which is the same empty. And for my example HTML, in a similar way, I will use a custom CSS on this document. At the moment, it's not used at all. And I will use some fonts. We will see this a little further. So let's continue. So I will try to make, in this webinar, my XML document to look like a little more like my HTML document, to be like more customized. So first of all, I need to make a really important thing, which is to define which content will be displayed inline and which content will be displayed as a block. So for this, I will use the CSS display property. And the basic values I will use only in this example are the block and the inline values. You have the details here. So the block will create a zone, and after this zone, the next block will come below the first one. The difference is that if I define an inline element for one of my elements, it will be displayed inside the block and will remain at the same level as the text contained in my block. So let's get back to our example. So at the moment, we don't have any customizations. We will go to we will use this in the content CSS, and we will do the following. So I will first do this and then make the explanation. So I will define a first rule which will be applied on all my elements and create a display block on them. Then for my specific elements, I want inline. So the inline element, the bold italic elements, I want them in my paragraphs, and I don't want them in the separate block. My links and my code samples will be displayed inline. So let's get back to our example and refresh. Now you see the content starts to be separated. So we have some titles which are now blocks. This is an inline element contained in the block, so it keeps the inline status and doesn't create another block. Same here with the bold element inside the paragraph, etc. This is my starting point. Now my document starts to look like what I want it to look like. Sorry. So let's continue to the next part. After my my first display is done, I would like to define some margins maybe and some paddings. So the best way to use this is, for example, to use the box model and to say, oh, I would like, for example, my title to have a small margin in the left or at the bottom of it. As for the first one, I will set a part of it in my content, and I will set this first. So the first rule I will apply will be applied on the document. So the full document will have a margin of 10 pixels. Then I will continue my customizations using the titles. So I want my titles to have a margin at the top, which is 1/4 of an inch, and a margin at the bottom, which is the same with the same value. Sorry. Here now you will see after the refresh that my 1/4 of an inch is applied here on all my title levels. And at the end, I will apply also a small padding to make a little change on my content. So I will apply a padding here. So here, as you can see, we find now there is a padding on some elements. Here you can see the value. For example, I can keep my inspector close to be sure my rule is applied. So I have some paddings. So this means that the space is inserted inside the block. So it's a space included in the block. If this block had a parent one, the space will be applied on the child element. So if I use some borders after on these elements, I will see that the space is inside these borders. Also, I can keep an eye on the rule applied, which is for my content.css, which is the display and the padding, for example, or here the margins. So for this one, I used the padding, as I explained, which is inside the box model, and the margin, which is outside the box model. If you have some difficulty seeing the differences, you can add the background color property and set, for example, blue or gray on the content and see that the background color is this area colored will be bigger than the content. Don't forget that you can use some shorthand properties to apply this value. If you want to apply this value on all the margins, you don't need to define the top, bottom, left, and right. Specifically, you can just define the margin as a global shorthand. And you can define, for example, a margin of 1 pixel, which will be applied on all top, bottom, left, and right sides. Or if you want, as I did in my example, I used the specific properties, which because I wanted only my margins to be applied on some of the sides, so top and bottom in my examples. Now, for example, I can continue to use the box model to apply some borders on my documents. So let's get back to my example, and I will apply a border in this block element. So let's check first my content. So here is my content I will use. I will did now refresh. So as you can see, I use a border with a shorthand. So I want all my borders to be from 1 millimeter displayed in solid blue, which is a strong line all around my content. I use also this selector, which means only the inlines inside the block will apply this content. If I add another inline element, it will not have any border around it because it's not contained in the block element. I can also change this content to use a specific border element, which is the border bottom, still defined with the 1 millimeter solid blue. And I will see now only the bottom border will appear inside my document. You may have remarked that at the moment I remove the other border, my text slightly go upside. This is exactly because I used the box model, as my content was a little bit down before, because above it has this border of 1 millimeter. Now, as the border does not exist above and on the left side, my text get a little more up. So let's continue. So as for the margin and padding, you will find a lot of shorthands for border because you have the width, style, and color. And for all of them, you will find the top, bottom, left, and right specific sides. Obviously, all this combination of this property works, and you can find more information about this and more example in the Mozilla Developer Network, but I will come back after on this link. So I will continue to customize my XML document. Now I can, for example, use some colors for make my titles maybe easier to catch. So the two property I will use in this case for these examples are the color and the background color properties. Oxygen PDF chemistry supports all kind of values for this color and background colors. So you can use directly the name of the color you want. You can use the hexadecimal values or the RGB function, which gives the red, green, blue values and mix them to obtain your color. So as for the others, I will show it in my example. I will use a part of my colors. I will color my code element and I will color my titles. So let's use these rules. I will save my style sheets. Now nothing is different. Don't forget to refresh. Now you see all the titles are blue as they applied this, which is converted in RGB function, but it's exactly this color is blue in hexa value. And I set my code element using two different values. So I want a color, which is quite red in this example, and a background color, which is set on light gray. So this is exactly what we obtain here. Let's move further and go to links. Maybe not all of you knows that you can define a link directly in CSS, and you can use for that the link property, which is here, and the function attribute, which is the function which will give the target to the link. So I will use exactly this selector in my document. Let's go back to my content. Let's select my link. So my link will be a blue link using the href as the destination, and it will be underlined to be easier to see. Again, refresh. This is my link. As you can see, my mouse pointer already changes to indicate me that this is a link, and it already works in this case, and you will see at the end that this link also works in the PDF output. Now we will continue this part on specific on the fonts. So the best way to define fonts in a CSS document is to use the font family and the font size properties as a starting point. The font family can be written as a generic family name, for example, serif, sans serif, and monospace names. Or you can use directly a font family name, which is the font you maybe all of you, I suppose, knows from, for example, Microsoft Office or your browser. You may have seen that there is a plenty of fonts depending of your platform. And you may also remark that in the case I wrote Times New Roman, I add some quotes. You must use them because the difference between the two values is that Arial is a single name and Times New Roman, the whole name in fact is this one. So you may need to use the quotes to be sure it will use this name. Usually the font size are defined in points as in Microsoft Office or most of the Office suites. So let's add some examples. As for this, I will add for my whole titles, I will use this. So I will make my titles from bigger for the first one to lower to the last one. So let's copy this. This is it. And I will use for all my documents, I want the default font size to be set on 18 points. Another part I will use in this example is some other useful font properties, which is the font weight, indicating if you are using a thin font or a bolded font, or a style on the, or if I apply a style on my font, for example, italic. So as my example contains some bold and italic content, I will apply this also. So I want the bold element to be bolded and the italic element to be displayed in italic. So let's get back to my examples. As usual, I will refresh. Now you see there is a huge difference now that as the fonts, all my fonts changes there. Here is the big font and going lower and lower to my smaller fonts. The bolded content is now displayed bold as it applied the font weight, and the italic elements are displayed in italic. So I will also add the code example. As you may see, this code element doesn't differ from the rest of my content. And to be sure a user which reads my document see it, I will set it as a monospace font. So now you will see the font changes. Now it's a monospace font. This means all the letters and all the characters have the same size. It's a monospace, so it's exactly the same space here than here. I will continue there. So this is the full example of the font. We will go a little deeper in this using the web fonts. So two different ways to use the web fonts. You can import them directly. For example, I will use in this case the fonts from Google, so the fonts.google.com. And in my example, I will use the Noto serif font. So I search for it, I select it. And as I want to use all of them, so the regular one is the default one used by most of the text, and it has also a specific bold content. So I will select all my styles. And what I have to do next is go in embed, because I want it in my documents, to use the import selector. And as you can see here, I have an URL going to fonts.googleapis.com with my not a serif font and all I selected for it. So I will take it here, go back to my example. Now to make it easier to read, I will use the HTML example. So now I will go on my customization. Now you may see that I already copied the URL here. And the only thing I have to do is to uncomment this. So now this defines the titles of my example, which is not a serif, so the one I used here. I need to mention that the best use case for this is always when you set a specific font, don't forget to add a fallback or more than one to be sure that if a character is not rendered correctly, the fallback font will be used instead. So as I use a serif font, I set as a fallback the serif default font. I will also customize the paragraphs. I will set them to Arial. Arial is a sans serif font, so I set as for the first one a fallback to the sans serif default and the font size. So I need to save this ones. Go back here. As you can see now, the CSS already done the change. Now you can see this here, or if I go back to my browser, if you prefer the browser, you can inspect the element and see that if you go to fonts, the not a serif font is displayed. And in this case, it's Arial. To continue to the web fonts, another thing you can do is to download directly the fonts. Normally, they are used as some TTF fonts, for example, or they are all included in a zip file. And in this case, you have to declare them using the font face rule. So let's go back to my example. I will set back this. And I will directly go in this import. So this is why I had already the style sheet ready for my customization. Here I used some fonts, which are the Ubuntu bold and regular fonts. So as you can see here, I declare both fonts. So I name them Ubuntu. Both are normal fonts. The font weight 400 is the regular font, so I set the URL to the regular font, and I will set the same, but using the font weight 700, which is the bold font weight for my Ubuntu bold. And as I did in my first example, I will display the paragraph using my Ubuntu font and sans serif as the fallback, and I will display it using the font size of 14 points. Let's go back to my example. And here you already see that my font on my paragraph is now Ubuntu. As for the first example, if I go back to my browser, it displays Ubuntu as the new font. For more information regarding this part, you may go to how to embed font in Oxygen Chemistry, and you will find another example for what I have shown you before. Now for the last part, I will enter a little in this part, which is how to define pages. Because as our output will be a page output because it's a PDF, I need to customize the page because I may want them to be A4 or US letter, for example. So for this, I will use the print specific rules, which are the page rule. And I will use which is called the page margin boxes to set some content in it. And I will use a small counter to display the page number. So let's go to my example. I will go back here. Now I will use a define page. So you may see here that I defined a counter, which I reset on the root element of my document. So my XML element is starting with document. So I set a new counter called page, and I set a new page rule, which says that the page size I will use is the US letter size. You may find more details about all the different size in the Mozilla Developer Network. And I will add two small contents on the top center of my page. I want to display CSS as it's the title of my document. And in the bottom center part, I want to display my counter. So I will use the counter function and the counter I defined previously, so the page. And with that, I finally finish my examples. So I can go back in my documents, start a new transformation. It's an XML to PDF transformation with CSS. I apply the style sheets which are defined already in my documents. If you don't have your documents already embedded, the rule, you may add them here, the main one. Once I finished, I just press apply. I wait a little and I will see the result as what you see is what you get content. So it will look like the content I see in my author mode. So here you can see my document. You may see that it's a CSS document called. So this is the top center margin box, the bottom center margin box containing 1, which is the value of my counter. As my document is now in US letter, it's a little too small for all my content. So I have a second page, which is also numbered correctly. I can also check back in this content that in my document properties, it used some fonts. And you may see, besides the default fonts applied by my PDF viewer, all the fonts I define here, which are Times New Roman in my case. I will do another example here. So now I finished also this example. I will do another transformation, which is as the first one using this, and I can add the custom CSS if it's not already done inside the document. I will apply the content. And as it will finish, I will see that my document is now defined correctly. And here also we may find the fonts I define, which are here. So the Ubuntu font is imported in my output and is used as an embed subset. So don't worry if you don't catch the last part, as it's just an introduction to the page definition inside the whole world of page definition. If you need more information about the page margin boxes, you may find in our user guide a full documentation with all the specific values you can set inside your documents. To go further, for people who may be interested by other properties, values, and selectors, you can check the full chemistry user guide, especially the styling for print section, containing a lot of example and how-tos. You can also check the Mozilla Developer Network that I mentioned earlier in this presentation. It contains quite a lot of examples. You may search for a lot of elements, having examples for each of them, the values it can have, if there is some prerequisites, support for each browser, extra. And you may also find in our user guide a full example of the transformation of a whole book. It gets all the a part of the example I used, adding some other properties like the text align for the paragraphs, etc. And now, if you have more questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Julian. for your presentation. And thanks to all of you that asked questions during Julian's presentation. Let's go through them and try to offer the audience some answers.
Okay.
Okay. First question, how can I debug CSS for author mode? Because when CSS uses advanced functions such as oxy functions, for one example would be oxypath, sometimes editing in author mode becomes slower in response.
Also, we already have, as the user mentioned, oxy xpath function, which is quite, I think, the heaviest CSS function we have, as it allows the user to get some content from the document, and as it searches the entire document, it may make the whole process a little slower for the Oxygen, and this is why maybe you may try to use the oxyxpath function, but I will detail this in another webinar, but you may need to use a perfect xpath if your document is really huge, to don't make the search slow.
Let's go to the next question. Now, if we are defining for paper, should we use pixels for margins or shouldn't we?
Normally, I guess the best unit you can use is this one, will be the inch, I think, for most of the users. But normally you can define in every unit you want to set on the margins, but I guess the best practice is to use the inch. But it depends on your needs. You can also find if you prefer the centimeters or you're more fond of the metric units, you can use the metric units also.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. In the title element, there are two rules for title. Why does the first rule apply? According to rule properties, only the second one should apply. Can you please
Okay,
explain
I
this
will
a little bit more?
make the details. So maybe you did not understand correctly. In fact, if there is two rules for titles, only the second one will apply if the first one contains the same set of properties. So only the duplicated properties will not be applied on the first rule. So if I define, for example, for the title, two font size, only the second one will apply on my documents. But if I define, as I did in my example, a color in the first title and I define a font size in the second, both rules will apply. It's only if there is a conflict between them, only the last one will be used. But if there is no conflict, you can set dozens of rules using the same selectors. The only thing to keep in mind is to don't duplicate and to not create conflict, because you may find some errors and you may be blocked sometimes and see why my rule is not applied.
Okay, thank you. Going to the next question. How fully Oxygen supports CSS standard for author mode?
Normally, Oxygen will normally support full CSS 3, I think, supports. So you may have to use, I think sure, we are using 100% of CSS2 properties, and I think most of the CSS3 properties are also supported. You may find some problems here, but I think for most of the use cases, also the CSS3 works. And I think we have a user guide, a topic in the user guide related to the full support of the CSS standards.
Okay. One of our audience members asked us, what's the difference between this and XSL FO?
As I think normally there is no difference between them, because you may obtain at the end, you will obtain a PDF output. The big advantage of using CSS is that for most of the users, it's really easy to use because you don't need the full XSLFO processor knowledge, which is quite huge for a normal user. So it can be really painful to study a lot of XSLT and how to use XSLFO. And I think for most of the use cases, the CSS fit the user needs and is really easier to use. So this is the main and I think the only difference. So if you know XSLFO, you can keep it. But if you don't really know and you want something easier to use, just by setting a few rules in CSS, as you have seen today, you may obtain a quite nice PDF output.
Thank you. Now going to a subject that you mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, how can we make, can we use what you taught us today to make it work with data instead of XML?
So maybe I may show a little more in this case. So if you're using data, you may be used to this view, which is the data maps manager. So if you have a data document instead of an XML document, you may already find here some transformation scenarios, which is the data map PDF based on HTML and CSS, which in fact use the CSS customization and Oxygen PDF chemistry in the background. And you may obtain a correct result also in this case using CSS. The small differences you may find here is normally for data documents, we highly recommend the usage of the classes on the elements, as data defines a lot of different elements which are grouped by subclasses. So we highly recommend the usage of the classes instead of the elements as I used in my example today.
Okay, thank you. Another audience member asks you, Julian, if you could show us for a moment the plain XML of the example.xml file that you used.
Sure, I can. So I can get back to my original documents and put them also one in one part and the other in the other part. So here is my HTML document, and here is my XML documents. As I mentioned during the transformation, I did not indicated the CSS as I applied the style sheet already imported in the document here as a style sheet and here as an XML style sheet. You may see that the documents are quite similar. I defined some titles, body, block elements, titles, paragraphs, etc. Anyway, you will find these documents at the end of the webinar, maybe tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, in the event section with all these documents attached.
Oh, perfect. Can CSS be used in conjunction with XSL, or is there something that CSS can do and XSL cannot?
Oh, sure, you can combine both XSL and CSS if you both have knowledge about CSS and XSL. As far as I know, sure, you can use it in data because we already define extension points that may allow the users to add some XSLT style sheets. But this is not exactly the scope of this webinar, and we will plan another set of webinars talking more specifically about data. So maybe not from the beginning, but maybe at some point we will also show the XSL extensions. But you may find in our user guide also a full topic explaining which are the extension points, existing extension points, and how you can set them for data.
One of the audience members has another interesting question that sounds like this. I assume that the entire data document could be transferred to PDF document using CSS. Now, what's the best practice for PDF generation using XSLT or CSS? And of course, the pros and the cons for this.
The So let's start. I will start with XLFO. The pros is that I think you may obtain an output which is exactly the most customized output you may obtain. So you may be using XSLFO have something which is more point to point. You can customize absolutely everything, maybe more completely. But the cons for the XSLFO is, as I said before, it's really huge and you have to study a lot of XSLFO because there is really a lot of things to do to understand correctly and use XSLFO. To get back to the CSS transformation, the pros obviously is that it's much more easier that the XSLFO transformation. Absolutely everybody can use the CSS as a specific style sheet for defining their output. And we also consider that this may be the future of the transformation as I mentioned also, it is really mainstream, so it can be used by all the people. So you don't need to use a specific guy to customize your XSLFO style sheets. Everybody can write a few selectors, as you have seen today. I don't wrote a lot of them. It's only a few. It's not even 50 line of CSS, and you have seen that the output is quite complete already. So we consider that in the future, most of the people will go from the XSLFO to the CSS as it's easier to use.
Thank you. Julian, if you are using Data, when using a custom framework as a Data extension and the custom CSS is specified for the framework, can you describe how the rules are applied? That is, how our frameworks and their priority are applied?
So if you have a custom framework which defines already some style sheets, they will be applied with a higher priority than the Oxygen default data framework, CSS. And also, if you add to this framework-based CSS style sheets, some style sheets at the file level, those style sheets will be also with a higher priority than the frameworks and the default of the Oxygen defaults one. So normally, if you add some rules in any ways, Oxygen is done to use always your rules before ours. And if some of them are not overwritten, you can try to make, as I explained at the beginning, a more specific rule maybe for this example, or use directly the important annotation.
A lot of our audience members are thanking you, Julian, for your
Thank you for
presentation,
being also here.
as it served a great refresher for some of them. And let's go to the last question. How can you map a data output class to a CSS definition, for example, a table header format?
So let's get back to data. I will use this example. So if I use the flower, for example, it's a sample distributed in the Oxygen installation. I can set if you want, so you want the table header. So the best for this is to go on the flower. So my sample is here. You can see the data map. I will go on the output folder, go to the PDF transformation. So I transform already once my document to see the default transformation. then the simplest way to define something is to go, for example, in my browser. So I have a .merge.html document, which is generated only for data documents. Then I just need to select my documents. Let's make this a little bigger. And if I want to select only the caption of my, so I think by header, you mean all the caption, or if you prefer this header, you may find here the elements, and normally the things we are using here for this is to select the topic head class, to select the whole header. Then if you want to use it on the full header, you may set your explanations here. So you can add your selector here, or if you prefer to add it on the specific one, you may need to use the topic T head, then select the topic entry. But you surely you may find a lot more explanation, as I also explained before, in our user guide. This is quite a knowledge base for a lot of these examples. You may find, but be sure you select the data user guide, which is here. When you enter the documentation, please select sure the Ditaote CSS publishing PDF. And when you search there, you will find all the tables customization, and you may find here all you need to know, as it's a little more advanced customization, maybe for a part of the users which are here today. I think you may go directly here and see that how the selectors are made for the data.
Perfect. Well, Julian, we just went through all of our audience's questions. So thank you all for showing your involvement. And thank you again, Julian and Dan, for assisting us and helping us with the answers.
And thank you for people to be so many, even today, to attend this webinar.
Okay, I will take control back right now. Okay, let me remind you that the event is being recorded, and you will find the recording along with the sample files and slides on the event page. And if you have any comments or questions regarding the presentation, you can write to us directly by using the Oxygen feedback commenting platform found at the bottom of the event page. Now, before our webinar comes to an end, let me tell you a little bit about our upcoming events. So next week on October 28th, we will have the Explore Web Author Beyond Technical Documentation webinar. We will see some instances where web author comes in handy. For example, allowing you to build guided procedures so new users won't require additional training or validation. And on November 4th, we will have introducing the Oxygen Publishing Engine for DITA webinar that will also be presented by Julian. And this event will represent a crash course for you to learn what the Oxygen Publishing Engine is by showing you how to install it, configure it in a continuous integration system, and then customize the output. And more webinars will be added to this list. So make sure to check our events page, where you can also find the links to register for free. So reaching the end of our event, thank you again, Julian, for teaching us the basic CSS layout.
Welcome.
And of course, thank you everyone for taking part in today's live event. And I hope to see you all next week at the same time on Wednesday, 8 a.m. for US Pacific time, 11 a.m. for US Eastern time, and in Europe between 4 and 6 p.m. With this being said, goodbye.